An old black man, dressed in tattered clothes, walked into a Chase bank and quietly declared, "This bank is mine." The crowd immediately burst into mocking laughter, and the security guard moved toward him to escort him out. But as he slowly opened the worn-out bag on his shoulder, all laughter turned into stunned silence. Suddenly, the bank door swung open, attracting all the curious and mocking glances from the crowd inside. A figure slowly stepped in. It was an old black man, his hair a tangled mess of silver curls, his face etched with the harsh marks of time and hardship. He wore a thick, dark brown coat, patched up in several places, covered in dirt as though it had seen countless years of wandering. His shoes were worn out, the soles frayed, and every step he took seemed slow and laborious. On his shoulder was a rough, frayed canvas bag, faded by time, looking heavy. Upon seeing him, people inside the bank immediately began whispering to each other in low voices, their whispers mixed with soft, mocking laughter. A middle-aged white woman, dressed in expensive clothes, quickly pulled her purse closer to her, casting a glance that was both nervous and wary. A young bank employee standing by the counter smirked and whispered to a colleague, "That old man must have wandered in here by mistake. What a hassle." His colleague scoffed, nodding in agreement, throwing a disdainful look at the old man. The old man continued walking quietly, his deep black eyes calm yet resolute, seemingly unconcerned by the disdainful gazes directed at him from all directions. He slowly made his way to the center of the lobby, stopping in the heavy silence, filled with both curiosity and derision from the surrounding customers. A tall security guard, dressed in a neat uniform, took a few steps forward, his brow furrowed as he assessed the old man with an obviously unfriendly attitude. This was Stephen Miller, a burly white man known for his aggressive and impatient demeanor. He shook his head slightly, his hand resting on the holster of his gun, eyes full of disdain. The atmosphere seemed to freeze in a mix of curiosity and tension, as the old man slowly stood up straight in the bustling lobby, slowly raising his eyes to scan the faces that were directed toward him. Then, in a quiet but clear voice, he broke the suffocating silence in the bank. "This bank is mine." His words, soft yet determined, caused the entire lobby to fall into a stunned silence before a chorus of mocking laughter erupted, echoing mockingly throughout every corner. It seemed that Elijah Kirby, the old black man, had expected this reaction. He stood there unwavering, his gaze firm and strong, an enigmatic figure in the heart of Chase Bank, a place that seemed like it would never belong to him. But his appearance and declaration, though seemingly a joke, were about to stir up a storm greater than anyone could ever imagine. Elijah stood in the center of the lobby and spoke clearly, "This bank is mine." Immediately, the vast space inside the Chase Bank erupted with mocking laughter. At first, it was faint, but it quickly spread like a wave of disdain that engulfed the poor black old man. The crowd's laughter wasn't just from surprise, but also from a deep sense of contempt, as though Elijah's skin color and ragged appearance had turned him into a cheap joke in their eyes. In the corner of the room, two young tellers, Josh and Martin, leaned toward each other, whispering maliciously, "This old man must be drunk. These black folks from the slums always dream these crazy fantasies." Martin sneered. "Maybe he thinks this is the welfare office." Josh responded with a condescending laugh. Their words weren't whispered softly enough to avoid Elijah's ears, but he remained still, his gaze unwavering, looking directly at the main counter where the bank manager, James Temp, stood. Temp was a man in his 40s, with neatly combed blonde hair, a typical face of a well-educated white man from Rockview, with cold, light blue eyes always showing a hint of cautiousness and a touch of arrogance. Noticing the situation was drawing unnecessary attention, Temp quickly signaled for the security guard, Stephen Miller, to step forward. Stephen approached Elijah with an unmistakable sneer on his face. He gestured toward the front door and spoke in a patronizing tone. "Hey, old man, this isn't a place for you to wander in and cause trouble. You'd better leave before I have to get physical," Stephen said firmly, each word carrying a threatening tone, his hand resting on his gun holster. Elijah slowly turned to look at Stephen, his gaze unflinching. There was no sign of fear on his weathered face, only an odd sense of calmness that made Stephen hesitate for a few seconds. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Elijah said slowly, his voice still clear and steady, enough to echo throughout the space. "I'm here to take back what's mine, something this bank took from me over half a century ago." His strong and unwavering words once again silenced the entire lobby. James Temp, who had initially dismissed this as a small disturbance, now felt an unusual sense of unease. He stepped out from behind the counter and approached Elijah, his demeanor polite but cold, his eyes filled with doubt and impatience. "Sir, I'm not sure what you think, but you're mistaken. This bank has been here for decades, owned by the Matthews family since my grandfather's time. Perhaps you're confusing something," Temp said clearly, trying to maintain a professional calm, but failing to hide a fleeting look of contempt in his eyes. "I'm not mistaken," Elijah replied firmly, slowly placing his old canvas bag down on the floor, as if it contained a secret that was about to turn everything upside down. "I will show you, right here, right now." A few customers started to step back, exchanging glances filled with confusion and curiosity. The white customers, accustomed to the stable, wealthy life of Rockview, seemed inconvenienced by an old, poor black man disrupting their peaceful afternoon. Meanwhile, Stephen, growing increasingly impatient, stepped closer to Elijah and said sharply, "I'm warning you one last time, old man. Either you leave, or I'll call the police. Don't make this worse." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He simply bent down slowly and began to open the old canvas bag. His trembling hands were steady, each movement deliberate. Everyone held their breath, watching the old man's strange actions. Even Stephen paused for a beat, his hand on his gun holster slightly loosening, a mix of suspicion and curiosity written on his tense face. "Everything I need to say is in here," Elijah said softly but confidently, then slowly opened the bag, revealing what it had been concealing. The moment the bag opened, the entire lobby of Chase Bank fell into absolute silence, as those who witnessed the moment widened their eyes in shock. What Elijah had just revealed wasn't merely the nonsensical ramblings of an old, poor man. It was a truth so explosive it could potentially upend everything they thought they knew about this place. The moment the bag was opened, before anyone could see what was inside, Stephen Miller, the tall white security guard with a scowl, stepped forward with a distinctly aggressive demeanor. Without hesitation, he stamped his heel loudly on the marble floor, the sound intentionally breaking the silence that had spread throughout the lobby. "That's enough," Stephen barked, his words coming out like an order, full of contempt. "This is a bank, not a shelter for wandering black people causing trouble." His words echoed throughout the space, causing some of the white customers around him to nod in silent agreement, their eyes clearly reflecting deep-seated prejudices passed down through generations. The bank employees, who had been curious before, now subtly took a step back, their faces showing clear discomfort. Some even whispered to each other, seemingly in tacit agreement with the harsh insult just thrown. However, Elijah remained standing there, unmoving in the face of the insults and discriminatory stares aimed at him. His weathered face remained calm, his deep black eyes unwavering, even gleaming with an unusual resolve. He slowly raised his head and looked directly at Stephen, his gaze piercing enough to make Stephen feel a brief twinge of unease. "I'm not causing trouble," Elijah responded, his voice still calm, clear, and steady as cold steel. "I've come to reclaim what rightfully belongs to me. What you call me doesn't matter. The truth doesn't change because of insults." Stephen was slightly taken aback by the steadfastness and calmness of the frail old man standing before him. He was used to using harsh words and aggressive gestures to easily make people like Elijah back down, humiliated, and escorted out. But this time, Stephen clearly faced something he hadn't anticipated: the silent, unyielding strength of an old black man who seemed harmless. A small cough broke the tense air. James Temp, the bank manager, who had been silently observing from the beginning, finally spoke, his tone polite, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Stephen, please calm down," Temp said, still looking at Elijah with a cold gaze but no longer showing the clear contempt that the security guard had. "Sir, if you truly have any evidence, we will review it. But first, I request that you stop causing a disturbance in my bank." Elijah gave a slight nod, then slowly bent down, his old hands carefully pulling out a worn, yellowed ledger from the bag. He slowly raised it up, letting everyone see it clearly, and his voice rang out steadily but with weight. "This is the ledger of Chase Bank from 1948, the time when I founded this institution. I am Elijah C.K. Kirby, and I am the rightful owner of this bank before it was stolen by greed and racial hatred." His declaration caused the lobby to fall into another heavy silence, as astonished and confused glances were exchanged. Some customers, though still trying to maintain their disdainful expressions, now harbored a growing sense of curiosity and unease. Meanwhile, James Temp suddenly turned pale, his hand trembling slightly as he heard the name Kirby echo clearly throughout the expansive space of the bank. As for Stephen, despite maintaining a tough and aggressive expression on the outside, a flicker of doubt appeared deep in his eyes. He took half a step back, his hand that had previously been resting menacingly on his gun belt now subconsciously lowering. It seemed Stephen had just realized that the frail old black man standing before him was not simply a troublesome wanderer, as he had insulted him earlier. Elijah stood silently, holding the old ledger aloft, his gaze never leaving the now changing face of James Temp. In that moment, he knew that he had made those who had scorned and belittled him begin to reconsider, and more importantly, the truth he brought was slowly shaking the very foundation of the world they had always believed to be stable and inviolable. In an instant, the atmosphere in the bank shifted from one filled with contemptuous glances and mockery to one of tension and unease, as a truth was about to be revealed, a truth that had the potential to change everything. Amid the suffocating tension, Elijah stood still, lifting the old, tattered book as if it were a flag of truth that he had traded his whole life for. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly lowered the book, his aged eyes soaked with distant memories, yet sharp, scanning the faces that were watching him with tension. No one spoke. No one dared move, and even the breath seemed to freeze in that moment. Elijah, with a calm expression and deliberate movements, bent down and quietly placed the worn canvas bag on the marble floor. The sound it made in the absolute silence startled everyone in the bank's lobby, causing them all to freeze, holding their breath. That bag, which just moments ago had been dismissed as the cheap belongings of an old drifter, now became the focal point of every gaze, as if it held an earth-shattering truth waiting to be revealed. Stephen Miller, who had just moments ago looked at Elijah with the most contemptuous gaze, now lost the confidence he had earlier. He took a small step back, his legs moving involuntarily, as if his instincts were telling him that he had just come into contact with something uncontrollable. In that instant, the usual aggression and disdain that Stephen carried were replaced by a deep sense of doubt and caution. James Temp stood frozen, his face as rigid as stone, his eyes fixed on the bag as if he were hypnotized. Temp, a man known for his ability to control any situation, was famous in the banking world for handling difficult cases with a calm and professional demeanor. But this time, it was clear that Temp was being cornered into a situation he had never faced before. His hand unconsciously clenched, trembling slightly as though he were afraid of what lay inside that old, tattered bag. Elijah seemed in no rush. He let the silence and tension build to its peak, slowly bending down to untie the bag's string. His gnarled, wrinkled hands, worn by years of hardship, moved with a steadiness and determination that no one could deny. As soon as the last knot was undone, Elijah slowly opened the mouth of the bag, letting its contents slowly emerge into the light of the bank's lobby. Everyone present leaned in subconsciously, curious to see what awaited them. And then stacks of old, faded money slowly became visible, one bundle at a time, rolling gently out onto the cold marble floor, scattered in disarray. Each bundle clearly bore the old logo of Chase Bank, a symbol that had not been used for over half a century. The bills were yellowed, the edges worn, as though they had just been pulled from a long-forgotten storage vault, something even the most senior bank employees had never seen before. An invisible chill seemed to run down the spines of everyone in the lobby. Stephen's eyes widened in shock, trying to mask the confusion that was clearly rising on his face. He cast a doubtful look at James Temp, as if silently begging for an explanation, but Temp, too, looked just as startled, his face visibly pale as he stared at the ancient bundles of money. "It can't be," Temp whispered, his voice trembling, losing the calmness he usually exuded. How do you have this money?" Elijah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he carefully picked up one of the bundles, his aged, slender hand gently caressing the faded paper, as though holding a precious but painful piece of memory. His eyes briefly flashed with emotion, as if, for a moment, he was traveling back in time to the earliest days when he founded Chase Bank, when he laid each brick to build it, filled with dreams and hope. "In 1948, he spoke slowly, his voice quiet but clear enough for everyone to hear, "I founded this bank with my own hands and sweat. Every dollar, every brick beneath your feet carries my mark. But then, just because I'm black, you believed the lies and drove me out of here." Elijah's words rang out, clear, strong, filled with emotion and conviction. In the lobby, the curious gazes began to shift from awe to unease and confusion. Many began to feel ashamed as they realized the harsh truth that the old man had just revealed, though some stubbornly refused to believe his story. Stephen tried to regain his composure and stepped forward a little, his voice more cautious now, but still full of doubt. "How do we know this isn't some kind of scam, old man? Someone like you. Where could you get this?" Elijah looked straight into Stephen's eyes, his gaze so sharp it made the young security guard freeze, feeling an unexplainable sense of authority and resolve. "Because I am Elijah C.K. Kirby, the man this very bank stole his identity, his assets, and his life from." He paused for a moment, looking around the vast room, then continued, "And now, I'm here to take it all back." His words echoed through the lobby, leaving everyone stunned, as they began to realize that they were witnessing the beginning of a storm that would change everything they ever knew about Chase Bank, a truth that could no longer be buried. As Elijah's voice faded, the vast space inside Chase Bank seemed to thicken, each echo of his declaration still hanging in the air, heavy with tension. Ancient stacks of money lay scattered across the cold stone floor, each yellowed bill a haunting reminder of a forgotten past that this bank had buried over half a century ago. All eyes were fixed on the old man, a mix of astonishment and skepticism in their gaze. The bank manager, James Temp, had gone pale. Though he was always confident in his ability to handle any situation, this was clearly something beyond his imagination. Confronted with these old, yet undeniable pieces of evidence, he felt the once solid foundation of power beneath him beginning to shake. Temp quickly stepped forward, bent down, and picked up a bundle of old, faded bills. He stared at the worn logo imprinted on the crinkled paper, then turned to Elijah with an expression of both surprise and irritation. "You say you are Elijah C.K. Kirby, the original founder of Chase Bank in 1948? Temp tried to maintain a calm tone, but the tremor in his voice revealed his unease. "Yes," Elijah replied briefly but firmly, his gaze old yet sharp, cutting through every doubt. "I am the one who laid the first stones to build this bank. I spent my youth and heart to make Chase Bank a symbol from which you all benefit today. But it was all stolen from me, simply because I am black." Temp shook his head repeatedly, trying to deny what he had just heard. He knew that if what this old man said was true, then the entire history of Chase Bank, which he had always been so proud of, would be completely upended. Sweat began to bead on his forehead, and the composure he was so accustomed to was rapidly slipping away. James took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the situation, and looked at Elijah with an expression of both doubt and challenge. "What you're saying is hard to believe, Mr. Kirby. If you were the founder of this bank, why is there no record of you in the history of Chase Bank? I've studied every document of this bank, and I've never seen a name like that mentioned." Temp's voice grew more forceful, as if clinging to the slim hope that this was all just a misunderstanding or some kind of scam. Elijah did not respond immediately. Instead, he calmly reached into his bag once again and pulled out an old worn leather ledger with a dark brown cover, faintly imprinted with the words Chase Bank Ledger, 1948. He gently flipped through the yellowed and torn pages, then stopped at a particular page, where a series of signatures and handwritten notes in faded ink were recorded. "This is the first ledger of Chase Bank," Elijah spoke slowly, his voice deep but commanding, capturing the absolute attention of everyone present. "It has my name, Elijah C.K. Kirby, alongside my business partner at the time, John Williams. We founded this bank together, but then greed and racism made John Williams turn his back on me." His voice faltered slightly, his eyes filled with the deep pain of a man who had been betrayed by someone he once trusted. He continued in a steady but emotional tone. "Williams couldn't accept that a black man like me could own and lead a large bank like Chase. So he secretly conspired with other powerful people, forged documents, and spread lies that I was incapable of running the bank. They forced me out of the very project I had built, erased my name, and closed every door when I sought justice. Each of Elijah's words seemed like a sharp knife cutting through the veil of hidden history, causing those present in the bank to shiver. Some customers lowered their heads, feeling ashamed as they realized the injustice the old man had endured, while others remained skeptical, whispering to one another about the truth of his story. Stephen Miller, who had always maintained an aggressive attitude, now couldn't deny the seriousness in the old man's words. His gaze had lost its initial confidence, replaced by confusion and doubt. He quietly looked to Temp, waiting for orders or direction from his superior. James Temp, still gripping the old ledger tightly, nervously flipped through the pages, his anxiety growing with each turn. His heart raced as he clearly saw Elijah C.K. Kirby's signature on the first few lines about the bank's history. The words that seemed to have been dormant in the past now awakened with force, placing Temp in a situation he could no longer deny. "It can't be," Temp mumbled, his voice trembling with despair as he tried to deny what he was seeing. But the more he tried to deny it, the clearer it became that each old page was undeniable evidence of a deep, systemic injustice that had taken place more than 50 years ago. In the midst of the crushing tension, Elijah stood tall, his eyes bright and unwavering, as if he had never been defeated. He knew he had accomplished the impossible. The truth was starting to speak, and this time no one could stop it. For him, this was just the first step in a long journey to reclaim the justice that had been lost so long ago. As James Temp stood there, his trembling hand flipping through the yellowed pages, his eyes fixed on the signature and familiar handwriting of a past that seemed to have completely disappeared from this world, Elijah let out a quiet sigh, his gaze shifting toward the large window of Chase Bank, as if old memories suddenly rushed back, vivid and sharp, painfully clear. He quietly placed the ledger on the table, his bony fingers still trembling, not from fear, but from the emotion of remembering those bitter, distant days. The vast bank room sank into deep silence, all eyes fixed on the old man, as if waiting for the next part of the story. A truth that had been buried beneath the weight of greed and social prejudice for over half a century. Elijah slowly lifted his head, his eyes still full of life, but also hiding the pain, disappointment, and wounds that had never healed. He spoke, his voice gentle but resonant, carrying the deep sorrow of a life once betrayed. In 1948, John Williams and I started building this bank from nothing. Back then, society still had many barriers for black people like me. But that didn't discourage me. I poured my heart, my youth, and my dreams into every brick, every stone that made up this bank, hoping Chase Bank would become a symbol of fairness and prosperity. His voice slightly cracked, as if each memory tightened his throat, but Elijah continued his story with the resolve of someone who had lived through and witnessed each event. John Williams was my closest partner. At first, I trusted him unconditionally. I never imagined that greed and social prejudice could change a person so quickly. But what I couldn't foresee was that the very friend who had stood by my side would become the one to conspire to take everything from me. The people in the bank started to murmur among themselves, their faces a mix of confusion and sympathy. Even Stephen Miller, who was usually aggressive, fell into an unusual silence, as if reflecting on Elijah's words. Strong and sincere words that no one could ignore. Elijah paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the faces that were intently watching him, then continued, speaking slowly as if each word needed to be remembered deeply. One day, I will never forget. John secretly colluded with a group of powerful white shareholders, convincing them that a black man couldn't run a bank effectively. He used the most despicable reasons, leveraging my skin color to build a lie, claiming that I wasn't competent and that my presence would harm the bank's reputation. He took a deep breath, trying to remain calm before continuing. They quickly united and ousted me from the board using shady legal tactics. I tried to seek justice. I took all the evidence to court, pleading from one courtroom to the next, from one lawyer to another. But at that time, people like me, people of color, never had a voice in that biased society. By now, Elijah's voice quivered. His eyes filled with unshed tears that didn't fall. It seemed as though he was reliving the most painful days of his life, when every door to justice slammed shut before him simply because of his skin color, even though he held all the undeniable evidence of the truth. I went everywhere, from local governments to higher courts, presenting the irrefutable evidence again and again, but all I received in return was indifference, coldness, or even contempt. One judge even coldly looked at me and said, "You should know your place." How could a black man ever run a bank? The customers standing in the bank became still with emotion and confusion. A few lowered their heads in shame, realizing that the history they were witnessing was indeed cruel beyond belief. James Temp seemed frozen in place, his face now completely losing the arrogance it once held. It was as if he was finally seeing the grave injustice of the past that he had unknowingly inherited. Elijah took another deep breath, trying to keep his composure, his eyes brimming with emotion. But his voice grew sharper, stronger than ever as he continued. In the end, I was left with nothing. Not only did I lose the bank I had dedicated my life to building, but I also lost my dignity and career. They wiped my name from every record, erasing me from existence, as if I had never been here. He paused again, his deep gaze fixed on James Temp and Stephen Miller, as if trying to pierce their souls. And now I've returned, not for revenge, but to force you to face the truth. You must understand that every brick, every dollar, every breath of this bank came from my sacrifice and loss. Elijah's words reverberated powerfully in the thick silence. Everyone understood that the truth he had just revealed was not just the story of one man, but the deep pain, the stain in history that they had purposely chosen to forget. In that moment, Elijah stood there, resilient and unbowed, not just as an old man in poverty, but as a living symbol of the fight against injustice, prejudice, and greed that history had once buried. But now he had returned, and this time he would not allow anyone to erase him again. The atmosphere inside Chase Bank remained heavy with silence after Elijah finished recounting his painful story. The eyes of the crowd silently followed every small movement of the old man, with expressions of shock and a sense of shame as they realized they were witnessing a long-hidden, brutal past. It felt as though the air itself had become stagnant, waiting for something greater to emerge. In that tense moment, Elijah slowly bent down to his old canvas bag once again, his movements deliberate and steady, as if he wanted everyone in the room to fully witness the truth he was about to reveal. His eyes were calm yet resolute, carrying the confidence of a man who had waited over half a century to prove his innocence. From the bag, Elijah pulled out a stack of yellowed papers, carefully wrapped in oilskin, preserved like a precious artifact for decades. He stood up straight and carefully opened the oilskin, his aged fingers gently turning each page. All eyes in the room were immediately focused on him with a mix of curiosity and tension, waiting to see what this old man would reveal that might leave them in shock. "These are the original legal documents, never before disclosed," Elijah said, his voice clear yet calm. "These papers prove that I never signed any document transferring ownership of this bank to anyone, especially not to the Matthews family." The name Matthews immediately caused the room to tense up to the point that a few people standing nearby could be heard breathing heavily. Matthews was not a name unfamiliar to Chase Bank, as the Matthews family was one of the wealthiest and most powerful in Rockview. They had run the bank for generations, and no one had ever questioned the legitimacy of their ownership. James Temp, the bank manager standing closest to Elijah, began to feel everything around him spin, his legs nearly buckled, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Temp tried to maintain his composure, but his efforts only made his unease more apparent. He stammered, his voice trembling. "Whoa, what are you saying, Mr. Kirby? The Matthews family has always been the legitimate owner of Chase Bank. That's been recognized for generations." Elijah fixed his sharp gaze on Temp, as if piercing through every flimsy excuse the man could offer. He stepped closer to Temp, gently placing the stack of documents into the shaking hands of the stunned bank manager. "James, look at these documents for yourself. You'll understand better than anyone what I've just said. You've been living in the lie created by your predecessors." Temp reluctantly took the papers, trying to hold them steady so they wouldn't fall to the floor. He began reading, line by line, every signature and seal, faded by time but still clear enough to reveal a shocking truth. His heart raced, his face turning pale, as each line he read shattered his trust in the Matthews family's history, a history he had once been so proud of. Beside Temp, Stephen Miller, too, could no longer maintain his usual aggressive demeanor. He quietly observed the expression on his superior's face, a deep unease rising within him. Until now, Stephen had always believed he stood on the side of justice, on the side of societal order, but now that belief was being severely shaken. Finally, Temp stopped at a page bearing the signatures of Elijah C.K. Kirby and John Williams. He studied it more closely, feeling a jolt of cold run down his spine as he realized that there were no signatures from Elijah on any of the later property transfer documents. All the documents were signed and legitimized by John Williams and the Matthews family, quietly and insidiously. "No, it can't be," Temp muttered, his voice barely audible, for his ears alone. He looked up at Elijah, his face filled with disbelief and despair. "If these papers are real, then—" Elijah cut him off firmly, but his voice remained steady. "Then it means that Chase Bank was unlawfully seized by the Matthews family and John Williams, exploiting social prejudice to remove me. This is not just a story of greed, but a historical case, the clearest evidence of the injustice I've suffered throughout my life." The people in the bank were stunned by his declaration. Some had begun pulling out their phones to record the rare scene, while others stood frozen like statues, unable to believe what they were witnessing. A truth too big, too unexpected, was upending everything they thought they knew about the bank they had trusted all these years. Amid the chaos, Elijah remained steady, his gaze now carrying the determination and strength of a man who had endured too much pain but never lost faith in justice. He knew that, though it was late, the truth had finally come to light, and no one could deny it anymore. James Temp, still holding the legal papers that provided irrefutable evidence, slowly sank into a chair, his face numb, like someone just awakening from a long, deep sleep, forced to confront the greatest shock of his life. His world, and perhaps the history of Chase Bank, would never be the same again. As James Temp slowly sat down in his chair, his hands still trembling as they gripped the yellowed papers as if they were the last remnants of a world he had just lost, the entire Chase Bank lobby fell into a silent chaos. The whispers began to rise among the customers standing around, like an undercurrent swiftly spreading across the ocean, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and doubt. None of them had ever imagined that today, when they stepped into this familiar bank, they would witness a shocking truth that would shake and upend all their trust in a symbol of stability in the town of Rockview. Some began pulling out their phones to record the scene, their eyes filled with both curiosity and anxiety, while others kept glancing nervously toward the nearest exit, as if preparing to run away from a truth that was too hard to accept. In the midst of this chaotic atmosphere, Stephen Miller, a white security guard with a tall, muscular build and an aggressive demeanor, had regained his familiar sense of hostility. From the very beginning, Stephen had positioned himself as the guardian of order, and now he felt as though his power had been stripped away. The words Elijah had just spoken, the evidence that had been presented, seemed to Stephen like a blatant scam designed to disrupt the peace of the bank he was tasked with protecting. He took a deep breath, his face flushed with anger and confusion, his eyes burning with resentment and suspicion as he looked at Elijah. Then, with a decisive motion, Stephen placed his hand on the gun holster at his side, a gesture clearly meant to intimidate, strong enough to immediately capture the attention of everyone in the room. The entire lobby fell eerily silent, all eyes fixed on Stephen, filled with tension and worry. "Enough!" Stephen shouted, his voice ringing out in the silence, carrying both the anger and authority of someone trying to maintain the last shred of order. "This old man is clearly causing trouble, and all that evidence is fake. I won't let him continue to cause a scene here. Someone call the police right now." Stephen's words only heightened the already intense tension in the lobby. Some customers quickly backed away, moving toward the doors, trying to keep a safe distance from Elijah, as if he were truly a threat. Others stood frozen, their eyes wide in shock at the sudden escalation, unsure whether to believe the truth Elijah had just revealed or trust in the safety promised by Stephen's authority. Elijah stood still, his expression unafraid of Stephen's threatening actions. He simply gazed at the young security guard with deep, compassionate eyes, the eyes of someone who had endured countless injustices and was now witnessing that same injustice unfold right before him. "Mr. Miller," Elijah spoke gently but firmly, "I'm not causing trouble. I'm bringing the truth. Do you think it's right to hide a crime for over 50 years? Stephen faltered for a moment, but quickly masked it by gripping the gun holster even tighter, his impatience and unease becoming more apparent. He glanced around the lobby as if seeking support from the customers, but all he saw were confused, evasive, and skeptical looks being cast back at him. This only made Stephen more angry and unsettled. "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't care," Stephen snapped back in a harsh, challenging tone. "What I know for sure is that you've turned everything upside down here, and you're going to answer for it. Right now, sit still until the police arrive." James Temp finally lifted his head from the papers he had been clutching, his face pale and dazed, completely losing the composure of a bank manager. He stood up unsteadily, walking towards Stephen with an anxious gesture, his voice weak, as though trying to salvage the situation but lacking the strength to convince anyone. "Stephen, wait, we need to stay calm. I think we should check these documents carefully before doing anything else. This is not as simple a situation as you think." Stephen turned to look at Temp, his eyes filled with disappointment and anger. To him, it was utterly unacceptable for the bank manager, the one he had always seen as a reliable superior, to show weakness and doubt in the face of a stranger like Elijah. "What are you talking about, James?" Stephen yelled back, his voice now almost out of control. "Are you believing this old man's lies? Are you just going to stand by and let him destroy the reputation of our bank, ruin the jobs and lives of everyone here?" The entire lobby went silent at Stephen's sharp words. Temp stood frozen, unable to respond, while the customers grew more anxious, their steps edging toward the exit. Elijah remained still, calm but resolute, his gaze once again fixed on Stephen, as if challenging him that this time the truth would not be obscured by guns or power. Everyone was waiting for the police to arrive, but they all knew that, even when the authorities came, they would be faced with a historical truth that no one could easily deny anymore. When Stephen Miller's tense threat ended, James Temp remained motionless in the vast Chase Bank lobby. Every eye in the room was on him, waiting for a clear response, a decisive action from the manager who was usually calm and confident in handling any situation. But this time, James's expression was completely different. Pale, confused, and lost. He never imagined that one day he would face such a complex and painful decision. In James's hand were the yellowed legal documents, undeniable and complete evidence of the severe injustice Elijah C.K. Kirby had just brought to light. He looked down at the faded signatures, then slowly raised his head, his eyes meeting the calm but determined face of the old man Elijah. It was the gaze of a man who had waited too long for the truth to be recognized, the gaze of a past that could no longer stay hidden in the dark. James could feel that truth deeply. He knew, deep down, that what Elijah said was entirely correct. Every document was authentic, every signature clear, and the history he had always trusted turned out to be nothing more than a picture painted by lies and greed. But alongside that truth was an immense pressure weighing on him. The Matthews family, one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Rockview, had owned and run Chase Bank for decades. He knew better than anyone that they would not accept this truth easily, especially when it threatened to bring down the financial empire and power they had carefully built. A legal battle could stretch for years, costing untold amounts and undoubtedly causing severe damage to the bank's reputation as well as his own. James understood that a wrong decision now could cause everything he had worked for, his entire career, to crumble in an instant. In the midst of his chaotic thoughts, he caught Stephen Miller's gaze. Stephen still had his hand firmly on his gun holster, clearly showing his rigid, unyielding stance. This was the most distinct symbol of power, of the social order that James had always believed he was helping to uphold. But right now, that power stood in direct opposition to his own conscience and morals. James quietly scanned the lobby, witnessing the fearful and doubtful eyes of the customers, mingled with a bit of hope. Some of them had clearly started to believe Elijah's words, and some even looked at him with deep sympathy. James, too, couldn't help but feel moved by Elijah's decisiveness and courage as he faced all the hatred and contempt from the crowd to expose a truth that everyone wanted to avoid. His conscience began to speak loudly, telling him he couldn't remain silent while such a grave injustice was buried forever. But immediately, the image of the Matthews family's terrifying power appeared before his eyes, an unspoken warning that the consequences he would face could be enormous, perhaps costing him everything. Not just his job, but even his own safety and that of his family. "James, are you listening to me?" Stephen suddenly spoke, interrupting his chaotic thoughts, his face growing even more intense and impatient. "Do you really want to protect some old stranger and risk everything we've built?" James flinched, quickly turning to look at Stephen, his eyes confused to the point where he couldn't hide it. He didn't answer immediately, instead looking back at Elijah once more, as though searching for an answer. A clear direction from the old man who was physically weak but strangely strong in spirit. "Mr. Miller," James finally spoke, his voice trembling but still holding on to some strength. "We can't act rashly like this. These documents are very clear, and Mr. Kirby deserves to be heard fairly. I can't let this be dismissed so easily." Stephen looked at James with a mixture of disappointment and anger. Clearly, he never expected the manager he had always respected to show such weakness under this pressure, even leaning towards the old stranger. But just before Stephen could respond, James continued, this time his voice stronger. "Yes, I understand the pressure we will face from the Matthews family, but if we continue to hide this truth, we will never be able to forgive ourselves." As soon as those words were spoken, the entire bank lobby fell into silence. Elijah nodded slightly, as if silently acknowledging James. Within him, a new hope stirred, that after more than 50 years of futile struggle, he had finally reached the conscience and compassion of a man standing between power and truth. James knew well that, in an instant, he had placed himself in the middle of an intense legal battle with the Matthews family. But more importantly, he understood that he had done the right thing, the thing his conscience had silently demanded. For him, the real battle had just begun, but there was no turning back, because of himself, because of Elijah, and because of the truth that could no longer remain buried in darkness. As soon as James Temp finished speaking, the entire Chase Bank lobby sank into a strange but intense atmosphere. The space seemed to thicken, filled only with nervous breaths and glances mixed with doubt and empathy. Elijah stood still, quietly observing everything, his eyes carrying the calm of someone who had grown accustomed to facing the pain of the past. Yet, deep inside, there was the faint light of hope that had just been reignited. It was at this moment, in the sudden stillness, that a slender figure stepped out from behind the counter. It was Emily Carter, the youngest bank employee, known for her caution, her quiet nature, and her tendency to never speak out against serious matters. This small girl, who had silently observed everything from the beginning, seemed as though she could no longer remain silent. Emily's footsteps were light but firm as she decisively walked toward the old, faded money scattered across the shiny marble floor. All eyes in the room followed her steps, surprise written across everyone's face, especially Stephen Miller, who stood frozen, his eyes filled with anger and confusion. Emily bent down gently, her hand trembling, but still respectful as she carefully picked up a worn-out bill, its old Chase logo barely visible. She looked at the bill thoughtfully, then slowly moved toward Elijah, placing the bill softly on the table in front of him. It was a small gesture, but it held so much meaning. It wasn't just an act of respect, it was a silent declaration, confirming that she trusted Elijah's words and the evidence he presented. "I trust you, Mr. Kirby," Emily said, her voice soft but clear, echoing across the vast space of the bank. "Perhaps we've lived too long in lies, and now is the time to face the truth. As soon as Emily finished speaking, everyone in the bank stood frozen, as though they had just witnessed something of great importance. Stephen Miller's eyes widened, filled with shock and fury, as if he couldn't believe his ears. To him, Emily's act felt like a blatant betrayal, a slap to the face of the authority he had always trusted and defended. But Emily did not stop there. She turned to face her colleagues, her eyes full of determination and encouragement, as if calling them to step out of the cowardly silence, to break free from the chains of fear and power that had kept them trapped. Only seconds later, another young employee, Josh, who had previously looked down on Elijah, suddenly stepped forward, picking up another bill and gently placing it next to Emily's on the table. His action was quiet but powerful, like the most sincere apology he could offer at that moment. His eyes met Elijah's with a mixture of embarrassment and regret. I trust you too, Mr. Kirby. I'm sorry for the disrespect earlier." Josh spoke softly, his face red with embarrassment, but his eyes were sincere, filled with courage. After Josh, one by one, each employee in the bank, who had either remained silent or secretly supported Stephen's attitude, stepped forward. Each person bent down, picking up an old bill, and respectfully placed it on the table in front of Elijah. No words were spoken, but each small act created a powerful wave, clearly showing their agreement and respect for the elderly man who had been forgotten by history and unjustly treated. Elijah stood there, his eyes briefly showing deep emotion. For more than 50 years, he had fought alone in despair, continuously seeking justice that society and those in power had always denied him. But today, in this moment, he could feel more clearly than ever that he was no longer alone. These young people, though small in the face of the great power of authority and prejudice, had chosen to stand with him, with the truth he had spent his life fighting for. Standing in the corner of the room, Stephen Miller seemed stunned by the sudden and powerful shift in his colleague's behavior. He gritted his teeth, his hand resting on his gun holster, trembling as if trying to control the anger and confusion rising inside him. For Stephen, the actions just taken were not just a personal betrayal. They were a blow to the belief in social order he had worked so hard to maintain. James Temp, still standing by the counter, silently observed every development with a heart beating wildly with emotion. He too was surprised by Emily's and the other young bank employees' brave actions, something he had never expected. Now, he understood more than ever that the battle he had chosen was not going to be easy, but at this moment, he knew he was not alone in his journey to seek justice for Elijah. In the atmosphere of the bank, it felt as though a quiet revolution was taking place, one person at a time, each choosing to stand with Elijah, directly challenging the terrifying power and societal prejudice that had endured for more than half a century. And this revolution was beginning to write an entirely new chapter in the history of Chase Bank, a chapter built not on lies, but on truth, justice, and courage. The sudden wave of reactions from the bank staff quickly spread, creating an invisible pressure that made the atmosphere in the Chase Bank lobby more stifling than ever. Stephen Miller stood still for a moment, almost unable to believe his eyes. He felt as if the entire world he had once trusted was turning its back on him. His hand tightened around his gun holster, his fingers turning pale as he tried to contain the rising storm of anger within him. In his eyes now was a mix of fury and unease, for Stephen understood that things were slipping further and further out of control. The sense of power and authority that he had always believed he represented now seemed to be dissolving piece by piece before him. To Stephen, this was no longer just about the bank or ownership. It was a battle to protect the invisible power that had nourished his pride and confidence for so many years. "Are you all insane?" Stephen suddenly shouted, his voice sharp and echoing through the large room, causing everyone to jump and look at him in fear. His gaze swept over each person, as if forcing them to face him, to face the fear and anger bubbling inside him. Elijah, still standing firm amidst the emotional storm swirling around him, slowly turned his calm and resolute gaze toward Stephen. He knew that at this moment, any unrestrained word or action could lead to severe consequences. Yet, he showed no sign of wavering. In his eyes now was not only determination, but also the composure of someone who had weathered countless storms in life. "Mr. Miller," Elijah spoke slowly, his voice clear and resonant, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You don't need to do this. I'm not here to cause trouble or harm anyone. I just want the truth to come to light, justice to be returned to me, and to all those who have been treated unfairly like I was." But Elijah's sincere and calm words did nothing to calm Stephen. On the contrary, they only made him angrier. Stephen saw it as a provocation, a direct challenge to the power he was trying to maintain. Without another thought, Stephen suddenly drew his gun from the holster, his movement decisive yet filled with urgency, the gun half drawn as a clear threat. "I told you, old man, get out of here right now," Stephen shouted, his voice cracking with anger and tension. His hand trembled, but the gun was still aimed directly at Elijah, creating a terrifying image in the silent, tense atmosphere. Immediately, the entire room fell into a quiet panic. Everyone in the lobby held their breath, their eyes fixed on the trembling gun in Stephen's hand. Some customers began to move subtly toward the exit, trying to distance themselves from the danger, but no one dared to speak or make the slightest sound, for they all understood that even the smallest careless action could cause the situation to spiral out of control. James Temp stood right next to Elijah, his heart pounding, a storm of fear and responsibility rising within him. He knew he had to do something to stop the potential disaster unfolding before him. But James also knew that Stephen, in his current state, was unlikely to listen to anyone, and one wrong move from him could make everything much worse. "Stephen, calm down," James finally spoke up, his voice shaking, but trying to sound as firm and decisive as he could. He took a small step forward toward Stephen, his hand extended as if to ease the rising tension. "Put the gun down. This doesn't need to go any further. I understand how you're feeling, but trust me, this isn't the way to resolve it." But Stephen seemed not to hear James's words anymore. His eyes were full of panic and fury, his hand gripping the gun as if it were the last shred of power he had left. Stephen felt himself losing control, and that very loss of control made him more dangerous than ever. "No, James. You're the ones who need to stop," Stephen shouted, his voice harsh, almost breaking. "You're destroying everything we've built over decades, all because of the words of some old man we don't even know. I will not let that happen." At that moment, everyone in the bank lobby understood clearly that they were standing on the brink of a real disaster. The atmosphere had become so oppressive that it was hard to breathe, every second stretching into what felt like a century. Elijah still stood there, his gaze calm but firm, facing Stephen directly as if he were accepting whatever might happen. Meanwhile, James Temp felt heavier than ever. He stood between two opposing forces, on one side, conscience and justice, on the other, power and personal safety. And right now, in that taut, fragile moment, James understood more than ever that his next decision wouldn't just determine the fates of Elijah or Stephen, but would also define his own life and conscience. In the suffocating tension that filled the room, with every eye fixed on the trembling gun in Stephen Miller's hand, James Temp knew that he no longer had time to hesitate. This moment required a pivotal decision, one that would change not only his life forever, but also the fate of everyone present in the Chase Bank lobby. James took a deep breath, gathering all his remaining strength and courage, and slowly stepped forward, positioning himself between the cold barrel of the gun aimed at Elijah and the old man standing firm before him. Though his legs still trembled, James's gaze had become resolute and strong, in stark contrast to the panic and helplessness he had felt earlier. "Stephen," James spoke, his voice shaking slightly but still resonating through the large room, enough to command the full attention of everyone, especially Stephen. "I order you to lower your weapon immediately." Stephen paused for a moment, his eyes filled with confusion and fury, clearly shocked that James had chosen this critical moment to stand against him. He looked at James with a mix of anger and deep disappointment, his hand tightening on the gun, nearly losing his composure. "James, are you really taking his side?" Stephen shouted, his voice harsh, mixed with hurt and disbelief. "Are you really willing to throw everything we have away for the words of an old man?" James took another deep breath, trying to stay calm, but his voice betrayed the intense emotions rising within him. "It's not about him, Stephen. It's about the truth. I've gone through all the documents Mr. Kirby presented, and I've seen the clear evidence of serious mistakes made by this bank in the past." James paused, his voice softening yet still firm. "We can no longer ignore it. If we want a real future for this bank, the first thing we must do is face our history, no matter how painful it might be." His words reverberated powerfully through the room, silencing it once more. The bank employees, including Emily Carter, Josh, and the others, all turned their hopeful gazes toward James, realizing that they now had a true leader, one who was willing to stand up for justice and truth, even if it meant losing everything. Stephen gritted his teeth, struggling to suppress the anger and despair building within him. His hand, holding the gun, began to tremble noticeably, as if he were battling with himself, torn between the pride and power he had always believed in, and the truth that James had just brought to light. Whether he wanted to admit it or not, Stephen could not deny that James's words had struck a deep chord within him, and he felt trapped between the truth and his blind loyalty. "You know the Matthews family won't let this go, James," Stephen finally spoke, his voice quieter but still tinged with bitterness and rage. "You're putting yourself in a huge mess. Do you even understand the consequences you're about to face?" James looked Stephen straight in the eye, his voice no longer trembling, but calm and resolute to an astonishing degree. "I understand better than anyone, Stephen. But if I continue to conceal this truth, I will lose more than my career or money. I will lose myself." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink deeply into the minds of those around him. "This is our one chance to fix the mistakes of the past. No matter how powerful the Matthews family is, they can't bury the truth forever." Stephen slowly lowered his gun, reluctantly but clearly convinced by James's sincere and powerful words. His hand shook as he returned the gun to its holster, though his eyes still burned with anger, the tension in the room easing significantly. "You'll regret this decision, James," Stephen muttered, his voice low with disappointment and hurt, then took a step back, like a reluctant surrender to the power of the truth that had just been revealed. In the large room, Elijah remained silent, his gaze quietly observing everything that had just unfolded. A subtle, profound smile appeared on his face, a smile of gratitude and hope. Hope that after more than half a century of fighting alone, he now had people who were ready to stand by him to defend justice and righteousness. James turned back to look at Elijah, their eyes meeting in a moment of profound understanding. Without a word, both knew that they had just overcome a great challenge, one that not only determined the fate of the bank, but also opened a new path for justice to be heard after decades of silenced injustice. The atmosphere in the Chase Bank lobby finally began to calm, but everyone understood that the real battle was just beginning. However, with the courageous decision James had made, they could be certain that no matter how difficult the road ahead, the truth would ultimately prevail, and justice would never again be buried. As the atmosphere in the Chase Bank lobby gradually settled, everyone's gaze shifted toward Elijah Kirby, the elderly man who, after years of being denied, had finally found the recognition he so rightly deserved. No one spoke, but in every pair of eyes, in every face present, admiration and respect had completely replaced the disdain and mockery from before. Elijah stood still for a moment, slowly surveying the room, his eyes scanning both familiar and unfamiliar faces, as though he were trying to etch this precious moment into the very depths of his soul. He didn't seem to relish in the spiritual victory he had just achieved. On the contrary, his face remained calm, but for the first time in many decades, his eyes gleamed with a sense of pride and fulfillment that no one could deny. In that silence, Elijah turned to look at James Temp, the young bank manager who had just made the most important decision of his life. Elijah's gaze softened, filled with deep appreciation for the courage and honesty James had just displayed. He gently nodded toward James, a small gesture, but one that carried all the deepest gratitude, enough for James to understand that Elijah would never forget that decisive moment. The moment when a young man stood up for justice, facing power directly without hesitation. James met Elijah's gaze with emotion, a strange mix of pride rising in his heart. He might have paid a high price for his decision, but in that moment, seeing the peace and quiet joy in Elijah's eyes, James knew he had made the right choice. He had regained something more valuable than any money or power. That was his conscience, his dignity as a human being. Stephen Miller, standing some distance away, still wore an expression of tension and dissatisfaction, but his gun had returned to its holster, and he no longer had any intention of taking further action against Elijah. Yet, in Stephen's eyes, there was still much complexity. Anger mixed with helplessness, a sense of loss, and confusion over a situation he never imagined he would have to face. In the end, Stephen silently turned away, saying nothing, quietly accepting the truth that his power and pride had failed in the face of justice and truth. Elijah slowly turned toward the exit, gently bending down to pick up his old canvas bag, the one that had accompanied him on his long journey to reclaim honor and fairness. His weathered but steady hand gripped the bag, and he walked slowly toward the bank's door, each step filled with profound tranquility and peace. As he passed, every bank employee, Emily Carter, Josh, and many others, stood silently and nodded gently at him, a simple but meaningful gesture. Those nods were the sincerest apologies, a clear symbol of the deep respect they had for him, a man who had bravely fought and overcome the solid walls of injustice and prejudice. Some customers near the door automatically stepped aside, creating a path for the old man to walk through. No one said a word, but in every glance they cast upon him, sincere respect shone through, a universal acknowledgment that Elijah Kirby had won, a victory not with money or power, but the spiritual triumph of a man who refused to surrender to injustice. Before stepping through the large door, Elijah paused for a moment, turning back to look at the bank lobby one last time. In that moment, a strange feeling welled up in his heart. Happiness mixed with a hint of regret for the long, painful years that had passed. Elijah understood that, although he had won today, the price he had paid for this victory was a lifetime lived in obscurity, pain, and injustice. However, now, all that suffering seemed worthwhile, for he could finally look the world in the eye and know that he was no longer invisible. "Thank you all," Elijah spoke, his voice gentle yet resonating like a warm farewell. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak the truth. Thank you for listening." No one responded, but all of them bowed their heads slightly as a silent consensus of acknowledgement that he deserved their most sincere thanks. With a gentle, contented smile on his lips, Elijah stepped through the door, letting the late afternoon sunlight outside shine softly on his weathered yet proud face. Inside, his heart was filled with a perfect peace, for at last, after more than half a century of fighting alone in despair, the truth had spoken, and justice, though late, had returned to him. The bank door closed softly behind Elijah, but everyone inside knew that today's story would not end so easily. A new chapter in Chase Bank's history had just begun, and it would be a chapter built on the firm foundation of truth, courage, and justice that Elijah Kirby had spent his life protecting. Elijah walked slowly down the familiar street, his heart as light as it had ever felt. Though he knew that many challenges still awaited him ahead, today he had won, and that was enough for him to continue walking toward a future where he could now hold his head high, proud that his life had finally been recognized fairly and justly. Right after the Chase Bank doors closed behind Elijah Kirby, a silence lingered over the vast lobby, but the atmosphere had completely changed. No longer was there the suffocating tension or the overwhelming fear. Instead, a strange sense of solemnity and relief filled the air, as though everyone had just woken up from a long, painful dream. James Temp remained still in his position, his eyes fixed on the now closed doors through which Elijah had just left with pride and tranquility. In his mind, only one thought echoed loudly, stronger and clearer than ever. He would never let this truth be forgotten again. He knew well that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The Matthews family, those who had held ultimate power at Chase Bank for decades, would certainly not easily admit their past mistakes, especially when those truths could destroy the financial empire and reputation they had carefully built. But James had made a decision, and once that decision was made, he knew there would be no turning back. "Everyone," James finally turned, his voice clear, strong, and resolute, immediately drawing the attention of all the bank employees standing around. "Today is the most important day in the history of Chase Bank. We have just witnessed a painful truth being exposed, a truth that this bank has hidden for over half a century, but that does not mean we will continue to live in lies any longer." He paused briefly, looking around the room again, feeling the silent support in the eyes of Emily Carter, Josh, and many others, all of whom were looking at him with trust and great expectation. Then he continued, "I have decided to bring all of this before the board of directors and the bank's executive committee. I know this means I'm risking my entire career, but I would rather sacrifice everything than continue living and working in an institution that has built its reputation on injustice and lies." James's words resonated powerfully in the hearts of everyone present, creating a silent but strong wave of agreement. Emily Carter took a small step forward, her voice soft but filled with determination and sincerity. "You're not alone, James. We will stand with you, no matter what happens. This bank needs to change, and we will be the ones to start that change." The room was filled with quiet words of agreement from others. Josh nodded firmly, and several older employees began showing their support with looks of resolve and confidence. They all understood clearly that they were standing on the threshold of the most difficult legal battle in the bank's history, but it was the unity and belief in justice that would drive them to overcome any challenges ahead. In a distant corner of the lobby, Stephen Miller still stood there, but his gaze was no longer one of anger. Instead, there was a thoughtful silence, a complex expression as though he was beginning to realize that the fight he had once thought was about maintaining order and safety was in fact a fight to protect lies and injustice. Stephen didn't speak further, but deep down, he may have started to understand that he could never win if he continued to go against the flow of truth. The very next day, James Temp walked into the Chase Bank executive meeting room, carrying all the legal documents, ancient banknotes, and the original ledger of the bank, items that had been hidden and denied for decades. Standing before the entire leadership, the powerful and proud members of the Matthews family, James courageously revealed the entire truth, facing their sharp and angry gazes without flinching. The response from the executive board was exactly as James had predicted, filled with anger, denial, and veiled threats. But this time, James didn't back down. He knew he was fully prepared for this battle, a battle not only to defend Elijah Kirby but to save the soul and honor of Chase Bank. In a short time, Elijah's story and Chase Bank's secrets quickly spread throughout the town of Rockview, sparking an unprecedented wave of public opinion. The press began to investigate, bringing to light a series of past wrongdoings that the bank and the Matthews family had tried to conceal. The inevitable legal battle began, capturing the community's deep attention, and making Elijah Kirby a living symbol of the fight for justice and truth in the local area. Though the road ahead would be full of challenges, James and the other bank employees were ready to fight. They believed that no matter how long it took, truth and justice would ultimately triumph over all the forces of power and money. Elijah Kirby's story was no longer just about an old man reclaiming his bank. It had become a story of courage, faith, and justice. It quickly spread, inspiring many others who were fighting against injustice and discrimination. In the end, the powerful message this story left for everyone was clear. History can be distorted, but justice and truth will always prevail. Elijah Kirby may have spent his whole life waiting for this day, but in the end it had come. The day Chase Bank began writing a new chapter, a chapter built on fairness, truth, and the courage he had sown long ago. And for people like James Temp, Emily Carter, Josh, or even Stephen Miller, they all understood that by standing up against lies, they were helping to create a better future. A future where justice is no longer a distant dream, but a fundamental right everyone deserves to have. Elijah Kirby's story was not just a journey to reclaim justice for an old man once forgotten. It was a profound lesson about courage, perseverance, and the power of truth. No matter how much history may be twisted by greed and prejudice, in the end, justice will always find a way to prevail. So, after hearing this story, what do you think is most important for a person to stand strong against the pressures of injustice and power? If this story moved you, like the video. Share it widely with your friends to spread this meaningful message. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue joining us in the next deep and touching stories. Thank you for following along, and we'll meet again in the next stories.